The morning started, like any other at Buckingham Palace, with Queen Camilla preparing for what she believed would be a private meeting with a trusted antique dealer. The ornate sitting room on the second floor had been carefully chosen for its discretion, away from the main corridors where staff members constantly moved about their daily duties. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains as Camilla adjusted her pearl necklace. Unaware that this seemingly routine appointment would soon spiral into chaos, Marcus Thompson had been working as a palace guard for 12 years, and in all that time he had never questioned an order or stepped out of line. His record was spotless, his loyalty unquestionable, and his dedication to protecting the royal family absolute. Standing at 6 feet tall with graying temples, Marcus commanded respect from younger guards who looked up to his experience and professionalism. But beneath his calm exterior, financial pressures had been mounting for months. His daughter Emma needed surgery that the National Health Service couldn't provide quickly enough, and private treatment costs were astronomical. His wife Sarah had been working double shifts as a nurse, but their combined income still fell short of the medical bills. Marcus had applied for loans, sold family heirlooms, and even considered taking a second job, but nothing seemed enough. The weight of watching his child suffer while bureaucracy delayed her treatment had begun eating away at his resolve. The antique dealer, Charles Whitmore, arrived precisely at 10 in the morning, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expensive suit that spoke of wealth and discretion. He had been dealing with royal acquisitions for over 2 decades, specializing in items that required absolute confidentiality. Today's meeting involves several pieces from Queen Camilla's personal collection, items she wished to sell quietly without drawing public attention or media scrutiny. Marcus was assigned to guard duty. Outside the sitting room, a routine posting that normally involved standing silently for hours while important meetings took place behind closed doors. But as he listened to the muffled conversation inside, certain words caught his attention. The discussion centered around the St. Edward's crown, one of the most valuable and historically significant pieces in the crown jewels collection. Through the partially open door, Marcus could see Queen Camilla showing Whitmore detailed photographs of the crown, discussing its estimated value and the complexities of arranging a private sale. The numbers being mentioned were staggering, far beyond anything Marcus had ever imagined. His heart began racing as he realized what was happening, and a desperate plan began forming in his mind. The St. Edward's crown, used in coronations for centuries, was supposedly secure in the Tower of London, under heavy guard and multiple security systems, but Marcus knew from his security briefings that a detailed replica had been made for ceremonial purposes and was kept in a vault beneath the palace. The replica was so precise that only experts could distinguish it from the original, and its gold and precious stones alone made it worth millions. As the meeting continued, Marcus found himself calculating possibilities. If Queen Camilla could arrange a private sale, surely the security protocols could be bypassed under the right circumstances. His knowledge of palace security systems, gained through years of training and duty, suddenly seemed like an opportunity rather than a responsibility. The thought of his daughter's surgery, of ending her pain and giving her a normal childhood, pushed away any consideration of consequences. When Whitmore left with promises to contact certain discreet collectors, Queen Camilla retired to her private chambers for lunch. Marcus knew he had a narrow window of opportunity during the afternoon shift change, and certain areas of the palace would be temporarily less monitored. His hands trembled slightly as he made his decision. Knowing there was no turning back once he committed to this course of action, the palace vault required multiple security clearances. But Marcus had emergency access codes for situations involving threats to the royal family. Using these codes for personal gain was treason of the highest order. But desperation had clouded his judgment beyond rational thinking. He convinced himself that he was borrowing rather than stealing, that somehow he would find a way to return the crown once. His daughter's medical bills were paid, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the palace grounds. Marcus prepared to make the most dangerous decision of his life. He had always been the man others could depend on, the steady presence who never wavered in his duty. But love for his child and the crushing weight of helplessness had transformed him into someone he barely recognized. Someone willing to risk everything for a chance to save the person who meant more to him than his own life. The afternoon shift change occurred at precisely 3 o'clock, a routine Marcus had observed countless times without ever thinking of it as an opportunity. Today, however, he watched with calculating eyes as guards moved between their positions, creating brief gaps in surveillance coverage. His heart hammered against his ribs as he made his way toward the restricted areas of the palace, each step taking him further from the man he had always been. The underground vault lay beneath the palace's east wing. Accessible through a service corridor that most staff members rarely used, Marcus's security badge granted him access to nearly every area of the building, a privilege earned through years of exemplary service. As he descended the marble steps, the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like a physical force. But the image of his daughter's pale face in the hospital bed drove him forward. The vault door required both his security card and a biometric scan. Systems designed to keep the crown jewel's replica absolutely secure. Marcus placed his palm on the scanner, knowing that this action would be recorded in the security logs, creating an electronic trail that would eventually lead investigators directly to him. But in his desperate state, he convinced himself that he could find some way to explain his presence. Some story that would deflect suspicion until he could return the crown. Inside the climate-controlled vault, the St. Edward's crown replica sat on a velvet cushion within a reinforced glass case. Even in the artificial lighting, the gold seemed to glow with an inner fire. The precious stones caught and reflected every ray of light. Marcus had seen the crown many times during his security briefings, but never with the eyes of someone planning to steal it. The case itself presented another challenge, requiring a separate access code that Marcus had memorized during emergency protocol training. His fingers shook as he entered the numbers, each digit bringing him closer to a point of no return. The soft click of the lock disengaging seemed impossibly loud in the silent vault, and Marcus glanced around nervously, despite knowing he was alone. Lifting the crown from its resting place felt like holding history itself. The weight of centuries of tradition and ceremony balanced in his hands. For a moment, guilt overwhelmed his desperation, and he nearly returned the crown to its case. But then he thought of Emma's upcoming surgery consultation, of the specialist who had warned that further delays could result in permanent complications, and his resolve hardened once again. Marcus had planned to simply walk out with the crown concealed in a maintenance bag. But as he prepared to leave the vault, alarms began blaring throughout the palace. His blood turned to ice as he realized that some other security breach was occurring simultaneously with his theft. The timing was impossibly coincidental. He could hear frantic reports of an unauthorized intrusion in Queen Camillas' private quarters. Someone had been discovered searching through her personal belongings, and the entire palace was being locked down while security teams conducted a thorough sweep. Marcus found himself trapped in the vault with a stolen crown while dozens of guards searched every corner of the building. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he was committing the crime of his life, another criminal was operating elsewhere in the palace. But rather than seeing this as a sign to abandon his plan, Marcus viewed it as cover for his own activities. If security was focused on the intrusion upstairs, perhaps his presence in the vault would go unnoticed. Until he could escape, minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Marcus waited for the all-clear signal that would allow normal movement through the palace corridors. The crown seemed to grow heavier in his hands, and he began to understand the true weight of what he had done. This wasn't just theft. It was a betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. Violation of trust that had taken years to build. When the lockdown finally lifted, the crown hidden in a canvas bag marked with official maintenance department insignia, every guard he passed could potentially discover his secret. Every security camera could capture evidence of his crime. But somehow he managed to reach the service exit without being stopped. Outside the palace walls, London continued its busy afternoon routine, completely unaware of the drama unfolding within the royal residence. Marcus walked through Hyde Park with measured steps, fighting the urge to run, knowing that suspicious behavior would only draw unwanted attention. The bag containing the crown felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. And every person he passed seemed to be staring at him with knowing eyes. But his freedom was an illusion. And Marcus was about to discover just how quickly royal security could mobilize when one of their most precious artifacts went missing. The electronic trail he had left behind was already being analyzed, and within hours, investigators would have his name, his location, and a complete understanding of exactly what he had done. The real chaos was only just beginning. Detective Inspector Sarah Mills received the call at precisely 4:47 p.m. While reviewing case files in her cramped office at Scotland Yard, the voice on the other end belonged to Commander James Harrison, head of Royal Protection, and his tone carried an urgency that immediately set her on edge. When he spoke the words crown jewels, theft, and palace security breach, Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized this case would define or destroy her career. Within 30 minutes, Sarah found herself rushing through the palace gates in an unmarked police vehicle, her mind racing through the implications of what had occurred. She had worked high-profile cases before, but nothing approaching the magnitude of a theft from the royal collection. The media attention alone would be overwhelming, but more importantly, the political ramifications could affect Britain's relationship with Commonwealth nations and damage the monarchy's carefully maintained public image. Commander Harrison met her at the main entrance, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks of strain and frustration. He led her quickly through ornate corridors toward the vault, explaining the day's events in rapid, clipped sentences. The timeline seemed impossible. A guard with 12 years of exemplary service had somehow accessed the most secure area of the palace and walked out with a priceless artifact during a shift change. The vault itself told a story of meticulous planning and intimate knowledge of palace security systems. Marcus Thompson's biometric data showed he had entered the restricted area at 3:23 p.m. It remained for exactly 14 minutes. Enough time to bypass the additional security measures protecting the Crown's case. Security footage confirmed his presence, but the cameras had been mysteriously offline for a crucial 7-minute window, suggesting either incredible luck or inside knowledge of system maintenance schedules. Sarah studied Marcus's personnel file with growing bewilderment. His background check was spotless, his service record exemplary, and his colleagues described him as utterly reliable and devoted to the royal family. There were no indicators of financial distress, criminal associations, or political extremism that might explain such a dramatic betrayal. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Marcus Thompson had stolen one of Britain's most treasured artifacts. Meanwhile, across London, in a modest flat in Bermondsey, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the crown he had wrapped in an old towel. The reality of what he had done was beginning to sink in, and the weight of his actions felt crushing. His wife Sarah was at the hospital with Emma. Unaware that her husband had just committed high treason in a desperate attempt to pay for their daughter's surgery, the crown seemed to mock him from its hiding place, its beauty undimmed by his criminal act. Marcus had imagined feeling relief once he possessed something valuable enough to solve his family's crisis. But instead, he felt only terror and regret. He had no contacts in the criminal underworld, no knowledge of how to fence stolen goods, and no realistic plan for converting the crown into the money his daughter needed. His mobile phone had been ringing constantly since he arrived home. Calls from the palace personnel office that he couldn't bring himself to answer. Each ringtone felt like a countdown to his inevitable capture. And Marcus began to understand that he had traded his freedom and future for an object he had no idea how to use. The newspapers would paint him as a traitor, his family would be destroyed by scandal, and Emma would lose her father just when she needed him most. Back at the palace, Queen Camilla was being briefed on the theft by her private secretary and security detail. The irony that her own planned private sale had somehow coincided with an actual theft was lost on everyone except Charles Whitmore, the antique dealer who had left the palace hours earlier with detailed knowledge of the crown's value and significance. The timing troubled him, but he kept his concerns private. Unwilling to complicate an already explosive situation, Inspector Mills began constructing a timeline of the theft. interviewing staff members and reviewing security protocols that had somehow been compromised. The more she learned about Marcus Thompson, the less sense his crime made. He had risked everything for a theft that seemed impossible to complete successfully, suggesting either desperation beyond rational thinking or information that hadn't yet come to light. The investigation revealed that Marcus had used his emergency access codes to enter the vault, a violation of protocol that should have triggered additional security measures. But those measures had failed to activate due to what appeared to be a system glitch during the afternoon maintenance cycle. The coincidence seemed too convenient to ignore, raising questions about whether Marcus had acted alone or received assistance from someone with deeper knowledge of palace security systems. As evening approached, the palace staff buzzed with rumors and speculation about the missing guard and the stolen crown. Some remembered seeing Marcus acting strangely during recent weeks, while others insisted he had seemed perfectly normal. The truth was that Marcus had been fighting his private battle with such skill that even his closest colleagues hadn't noticed his growing desperation. The media hadn't yet learned of the theft, but Sarah knew that leak was inevitable. Once the story broke, the investigation would become exponentially more complex as reporters, politicians, and international observers demanded answers. She had perhaps 12 hours to make significant progress before the case became a public spectacle that would constrain her options and complicate every aspect of the investigation. Marcus sat in his flat, knowing that discovery was imminent, but unable to see any path forward that didn't end in disaster. He had committed the perfect crime in terms of execution, but had given no thought to what would happen next. He faced the devastating realization that his desperate gamble had only made his family's situation infinitely worse. At 6:30 a.m. the following morning, Marcus's modest flat in Bermondsey was surrounded by armed police officers from Scotland Yard's Specialist Firearms Unit. Detective Inspector Sarah Mills stood across the street, watching through binoculars as her team prepared to execute the arrest warrant. The electronic trail had led investigators directly to Marcus within hours of the theft. And now the most wanted man in? Britain was trapped in his own home with nowhere to run. Sarah had spent the entire night coordinating with Royal Protection Services, reviewing surveillance footage, and preparing for what promised to be a complex arrest. The suspect was trained in combat, familiar with police procedures, went presumably desperate enough to have already committed treason. Every precaution had been taken to ensure the operation proceeded safely. But the presence of Marcus's family complicated every aspect of the raid. Inside the flat, Marcus heard the commotion outside and knew his brief freedom had come to an end. His wife Sarah and daughter Emma were still at the hospital, sparing them the trauma of witnessing his arrest. But he knew they would soon learn the devastating truth about what he had done. The crown sat in their bedroom closet, wrapped in towels and hidden beneath winter clothes. A fortune that had become completely worthless the moment he touched it. The knock on the door came at exactly 6:35 a.m., firm and authoritative in a way that left no doubt about who stood outside. Marcus considered his options for perhaps 30 seconds before accepting that resistance would only make his situation worse. He opened the door with trembling hands and found himself face to face with Detective Inspector Mills, whose expression combined professional determination with genuine sadness for what he had thrown away. The arrest itself proceeded without incident, Marcus offering no resistance as handcuffs were applied and his rights were read. His colleagues from the palace would later describe the scene as heartbreaking, seeing a man they had trusted and respected being led away in police custody. The search of his flat quickly located the crown, confirming what investigators already knew but providing the physical evidence needed to ensure conviction. Queen Camilla received word of Marcus's arrest while taking her morning tea, and her reaction surprised those present with its complexity. Rather than relief or satisfaction, she expressed genuine sorrow for a man whose desperation had driven him to such extremes. She instructed her private secretary to discreetly inquire about Marcus's family situation. Suspecting that financial pressures had motivated the theft rather than greed or malice, The recovery of the crown triggered a comprehensive review of palace security protocols. With particular attention to emergency access procedures and vault protection systems, the ease with which Marcus had bypassed multiple layers of security embarrassed those responsible for royal protection and raised serious questions about vulnerabilities that other criminals might exploit. Changes would be implemented immediately, but the damage to confidence in palace security would take years to repair. Meanwhile, at the hospital where Emma Thompson was scheduled for surgery consultation, Sarah Thompson received a phone call that shattered her world completely. The voice belonged to a police liaison officer trained in delivering devastating news. But no amount of training could soften the impact of learning that her husband had been arrested for stealing the crown jewels. The surgery consultation was forgotten as Sarah struggled to process the enormity of what Marcus had done. Detective Inspector Mills conducted the formal interview with Marcus at a secure facility in central London, the questioning taking place in a room designed for high-profile cases requiring absolute confidentiality. Marcus waived his right to legal representation initially, apparently believing that honesty about his motivations might earn him some measure of leniency. His confession was complete and devastating. Laying out every detail of his crime with painful precision, the interview revealed the depth of Marcus's desperation and the gradual erosion of his moral boundaries under extreme pressure. Mills found herself sympathizing with his motivations while remaining absolutely clear about the seriousness of his crime. The theft of crown jewels carried penalties that could result in life imprisonment, and no amount of personal tragedy could excuse treason against the crown. Charles Whitmore, the antique dealer who had met with Queen Camilla the previous day, his presence at the palace hours before the crime seemed too coincidental to ignore. But thorough investigation revealed no evidence of conspiracy or advanced planning. The timing appeared to be genuinely unfortunate rather than coordinated, as news of the arrest began to leak to media outlets. Palace press officials worked frantically to control the narrative and minimize damage to the royal family's reputation. The story had every element that tabloid newspapers craved: betrayal, desperation, and scandal involving one of Britain's most sacred symbols. Keeping the focus on Marcus's personal circumstances rather than security failures became a primary concern. Emma Thompson's surgery was postponed indefinitely as the family's world collapsed around them. The medical bills that had driven Marcus to crime now seemed insignificant compared to legal fees and the social destruction that would follow his conviction. Sarah found herself alone with a sick child and a husband facing decades in prison, wondering how their stable, happy life had disintegrated so completely in less than 24 hours in his prison cell. Marcus stared at walls that would likely contain him for the rest of his productive life. Finally understanding the true cost of his desperate gamble, the crown had been recovered, but the damage to his family, his reputation, and the institution he had served faithfully for 12 years could never be undone. He had traded everything he valued for nothing, destroying his daughter's future while trying to save it. 3 weeks after Marcus's arrest, unexpected development changed everything about the case that had dominated headlines across Britain and beyond. Detective Inspector Sarah Mills received an urgent call from the forensics laboratory that left her staring at evidence reports in complete bewilderment. The crown that Marcus had stolen, the artifact that had triggered the most significant royal security breach in modern history, was not the official replica at all, but rather an elaborate fake worth perhaps a few £1,000s at most. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team and raised immediate questions about how such a substitution could have occurred without detection. Palace officials who had assumed the replica was secure in the vault were forced to confront the possibility that they had been victims of a much more sophisticated crime than anyone had imagined. The real question became not just who had stolen the fake crown, but who had stolen the replica and when. Sarah Mills found herself investigating 2 separate crimes that had somehow become entangled in ways that defied logical explanation. The timeline suggested that someone had replaced the official replica with the fake crown weeks, or possibly months before Marcus's desperate theft. but palace security logs showed no unauthorized access to the vault during that period. The substitution would have required detailed knowledge of palace security systems and access to resources far beyond. Marcus's capabilities. Queen Camilla's reaction to this revelation was particularly complex, as she realized that her private sale discussions with Charles Whitmore had unknowingly focused on an artifact that was already missing. The antique dealer's evaluation had been based on photographs of what they all believed to be the authentic replica. The meeting that had triggered Marcus's desperate plan had been built on false premises from the beginning. Marcus Thompson, sitting in his prison cell awaiting trial, received news of the discovery with emotions that swung between relief and devastation. On one hand, he had not actually stolen a priceless royal artifact, which might reduce his charges significantly. On the other hand, his sacrifice had been even more pointless than he had imagined, as he had destroyed his family's future for a worthless fake while the real perpetrator remained free and undetected. The media frenzy intensified, as reporters struggled to understand how the investigation had taken such an unexpected turn. Headlines proclaimed everything from Crown security and chaos as journalists competed to explain developments that seemed to contradict everything previously reported about the case. Public confidence in royal security plummeted. Even further, as the scope of the deception became apparent, Detective Inspector Mills began reconstructing the case from the beginning, this time looking for evidence of the original theft that had gone undetected for months. The sophistication required to create such an elaborate fake suggested professional criminals with significant resources and expertise, possibly connected to international art theft networks. Marcus's crime, devastating to his family, had inadvertently exposed a much more serious security breach. Charles Whitmore found himself under renewed scrutiny as investigators explored whether his involvement was as innocent as it had initially appeared. His expertise in royal artifacts and timing of the palace meeting raised questions about possible connections to the original theft, but thorough investigation continued to reveal no evidence of deliberate conspiracy. The coincidences remained troubling but apparently genuine. Sarah Thompson visited her husband in prison with their daughter Emma, the first time the family had been together since Marcus's arrest. The conversation was heartbreaking as they struggled to understand how their desperate situation had led them into the middle of a complex criminal conspiracy they had known nothing about. Emma's surgery remained postponed while the family's legal situation remained uncertain. Palace security underwent complete overhaul as officials attempted to determine exactly when the substitution had occurred and how their systems had been compromised. The discovery that their most secure vault had been breached without any detection was more damaging to institutional confidence than Marcus's desperate theft, which had at least been detected and resolved quickly. The original criminals remained free and potentially able to strike again. The investigation revealed that the fake crown was remarkably sophisticated. The level of craftsmanship suggested connections to criminal organizations with experience in museum-quality reproductions, possibly the same networks responsible for major art thefts across Europe in recent years. Queen Camilla privately instructed her legal team to ensure that Marcus Thompson received appropriate consideration for his circumstances during sentencing. While his crime remained serious, the discovery that he had stolen a worthless fake rather than a priceless artifact should influence the severity of his punishment. Her intervention was kept strictly confidential to avoid accusations of royal interference in judicial proceedings. Detective Mills realized that solving Marcus's case had become secondary to identifying the professional criminals who had orchestrated the original theft. The palace break-in had been a symptom of a much larger problem. She now faced the challenge of tracking sophisticated criminals who had successfully operated for months without detection. The electronic trails and security footage that had quickly led to Marcus would be useless against professionals who understood how to avoid such evidence. As the investigation expanded into International channels. Marcus Thompson remained in custody, his fate tied to crimes he had never imagined when he made his desperate decision to steal what he thought was a valuable royal artifact. His personal tragedy had become a footnote to a much larger story, but his family's future still hung in the balance while investigators pursued the real criminals who had started the entire chain of events. 6 months after the initial theft, Detective Inspector Sarah Mills stood in a converted warehouse in Amsterdam, watching international police teams catalog evidence from one of Europe's most sophisticated art theft operations. The investigation that had begun with Marcus Thompson's desperate crime had led to the discovery of a criminal network responsible for dozens of high-profile thefts across multiple countries. The fake crown that Marcus had stolen was just one piece of evidence in a case that spanned 3 continents. The breakthrough had come from an unexpected source, Charles Whitmore, the antique dealer whose meeting with Queen Camilla had unknowingly triggered the entire crisis. His expertise in royal artifacts had made him a target for the criminal organization, which had been using his reputation and connections to authenticate stolen items and arrange private sales. Whitmore had been unwittingly facilitating the network's operations for over 2 years. Believing he was dealing with legitimate collectors, Marcus Thompson's sentencing had reflected the complex circumstances of his case. The judge acknowledged that while his actions constituted serious crimes against the crown, his theft of a worthless fake rather than an authentic royal artifact, combined with his desperate family circumstances and cooperation with investigators, warranted leniency. He received 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 18 months, a sentence that allowed hope for rebuilding his family's future. The real St. Edward's crown replica was recovered from a private collector in Dubai who had purchased it believing that the collector, a respected businessman with no knowledge of the theft, cooperated fully with international authorities and even covered the costs of returning the crown to Britain. His experience highlighted how sophisticated the criminal network's operations had become, creating false provenance documents that fooled even experienced collectors. Queen Camillas' private sale plans had been permanently abandoned following the revelations about security breaches and international criminal involvement. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about the vulnerabilities inherent in private transactions involving royal artifacts, regardless of their official status. Palace policy was revised to prohibit such sales entirely. Through similar channels, Emma Thompson's surgery was finally scheduled, using funds raised through a public campaign that had emerged spontaneously after news of her father's motivations became public knowledge. The British people, moved by the story of a desperate father's love for his sick daughter, had contributed enough money to cover all medical expenses and provide additional support for the family's recovery. The irony was not lost on anyone that Marcus's crime had ultimately solved the problem he had been trying to address. Sarah Thompson had filed for divorce during Marcus's imprisonment, but reconciled with him during the final months of his sentence as the family worked toward healing. Her decision was influenced partly by the public sympathy their situation had generated, but primarily by her recognition that Marcus's crime had been motivated by love rather than greed. The couple entered counseling together, working to rebuild trust and communication that had been damaged by financial pressures and secret desperation. Detective Inspector Mills received commendation for her work on the case, which had evolved from a simple theft investigation into an international operation that dismantled a major criminal network. Her ability to see beyond the obvious evidence and pursue connections that others had missed led to arrests across multiple countries and recovery of stolen artifacts worth hundreds of millions of pounds. The case became a model for international cooperation in art crime investigation. The palace security overhaul that followed the discoveries was the most comprehensive in royal protection history. New protocols required multiple authentication steps for valuable artifacts, regular verification of vault contents, and enhanced coordination between different security departments. The embarrassment of missing a major theft for months while detecting a minor one immediately led to fundamental changes. To find his wife and daughter waiting outside the gates with genuine smiles for the first time in over a year, Emma's surgery had been successful, her recovery complete, and the family's financial crisis resolved through the unexpected generosity of strangers who had been moved by their story. The second chance Marcus had gained came not from his crime, but from the public's recognition of the love that had motivated it. Charles Whitmore's reputation survived the scandal after investigators confirmed that his involvement had been unwitting rather than deliberate. He became an advocate for enhanced authentication procedures in the antique trade. His cooperation with international investigators proved invaluable. In tracking stolen artifacts and identifying patterns in criminal behavior, the criminal network's leaders were eventually sentenced to lengthy prison terms in multiple countries. Their sophisticated operation dismantled through the international cooperation that Marcus's simple crime had triggered. The fake crown that had started everything was retained as evidence, a reminder of how complex criminal conspiracies could sometimes be exposed through the desperate actions of ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. 5 years later, Marcus Thompson returned to security work, though not with the royal family. His experience had made him an expert in identifying security vulnerabilities and criminal exploitation techniques, skills that proved valuable in private sector consulting. His family had not only survived the crisis, but emerged stronger, their bonds reinforced by shared struggle and the community support that had helped them rebuild. The crown that had once represented their destruction had ultimately become the symbol of their redemption.